The morning mist clung to the waters of Danora like the breath of dying gods, and Taira no Tamamori knew that by sunset, either his clan would reclaim their honor or the sea would become their grave. The date was the 25th day of the 3rd month, in the year 1185, and the final act of the Genpei War was about to unfold on these treacherous straits between Honshu and Kyushu. From the deck of his war vessel, Tamamori watched as nearly 500 ships of the Minamoto fleet emerged from the dawn like vengeful spirits. Their red banners snapped in the salt wind, bearing the white crests of his enemies who had driven the once mighty Tira clan from the capital. The decision would prove both tactically sound and tragically prophetic. There, standing proudly at the prow of the lead ship, was Yoshitsune himself, young, his armor gleaming like polished gold. The Minamoto commander raised his war fan, and the gesture rippled through his fleet like a wave. Soon, 500 ships were moving in perfect formation, their oars cutting through the water with mechanical precision. Behind him, barely half that number of Taira vessels bobbed in the churning waters, their crews consisting of seasoned warriors who had chosen death over dishonor. The young Minamoto general understood that his numerical advantage meant little if the battle remained. It arranged that Taira had always been superior archers. Samurai warriors leaped across the narrow gaps between vessels, their ancestral swords singing through the air as they sought honor in single combat. The confined space of the ship's decks created a peculiar intimacy to the violence. Men who might have been friends in different circumstances now faced each other with naked blades, their family honor hanging in the balance. There was no satisfaction in the kill, only the grim recognition that another family's son would not return home when this day ended. Their years of hunting and warfare in the western provinces having honed their skills to legendary status. The initial Minamoto assault had been bloodied but not broken, and he could see that several Taira vessels had been boarded successfully. However, the defenders were fighting with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose, and their resistance was proving more effective than anticipated. If the battle continued much longer, the changing tides could trap the larger Minamoto fleet in an unfavorable position, potentially turning their numerical advantage into a liability. These were not peasant conscripts fighting for coin or land. These were professional warriors whose very identity was bound to concepts of honor, loyalty, and martial excellence. The sound of combat intensified as more ships locked together in deadly embrace, their crews spilling onto enemy decks in waves of controlled violence. The narrow strait began to fill with the debris of war-broken arrows, scraps of armor, and the occasional body that slipped between the wooden hulls to disappear beneath the dark waters. Every clash of weapons carried the weight of ancestral expectations and clan pride. His great sword moved in devastating arcs, clearing space around him as lesser fighters fell back before his advance. Come and test your steel against a true warrior. This was no ordinary soldier. This was Sasaki no Uemura, one of Yoshitsune's most trusted retainers and a man whose reputation for battlefield prowess was whispered in both camps. The Taira veteran's Naginata moved in flowing patterns, seeking openings while simultaneously protecting his own vital areas. His grandmother, Tira no Tokiko, held him close while whispering prayers to the gods of sea and wind. Blood slicked the wooden decks, making footing treacherous for warriors already struggling to maintain balance on the rolling vessels. Tamamori wiped crimson spray from his eyes and surveyed the carnage. Surrounding his position, the Minamoto assault had been relentless, and Taira resistance was beginning to crack under the sustained pressure. The sacred imperial regalia, the mirror, sword, and jewel that legitimized imperial rule rested in lacquered boxes nearby, their presence a constant reminder of what would be lost if the Taira cause failed this day. His opponent fought bravely but predictably, and within moments Tamamori's blade found the gap beneath the young man's arm guard. In another hour, it will favor the Taira position. At their head sailed the vessel of Minamoto no Yoshi, the brilliant tactician whose cavalry charges had shattered Taira forces at Ichi. In the distance, fishing boats fled towards safe harbors, their crews understanding that the waters of Danarura were about to run red with noble blood. We fight with the honor of our ancestors. We die with the dignity of samurai. Let the Minamoto come. Let them taste the fury of the Taira one final time. Tamamori had fought in a dozen engagements during this 5-year conflict, had seen a bodice of his brothers and cousins scattered across countless battlefields, and had watched his clan's power crumble like cherry blossoms in a storm. Tamamori raised his iron war fan, and the Taira response came swift and deadly, a counter volley that found its mark among the enemy ranks with satisfying precision. But today felt different. Today carried the weight of finality. The young commander's reputation for military genius was matched only by his reputation for mercy toward defeated enemies, a trait that both impressed and troubled. The Taira warrior, my lord, whispered his retainer, Kazuhiro, the child emperor Antoku is prepared. The sacred regalia are secured. The boy spoke of their 8-year-old sovereign, the grandson of Taira no Kyoto, who had ruled Japan with an iron fist before his death 4 years prior. Now the child sat in the imperial cabin, unaware that he carried the fate of a dynasty in his small hands. Tamamori's weathered fingers tightened around his naginata as he observed the approaching enemy. The wind shifted, carrying with it the sound of war drums and the distant shouts of men preparing for battle. According to historical accounts documented in the hike, the Taira forces had deliberately chosen this narrow strait for their last stand, hoping that their superior knowledge of the local currents would compensate for their numerical disadvantage. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the mist, Tomomori could make out individual figures on the enemy vessels. "Signal the fleet," Tomomori commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had accepted his fate. The crimson banners of both clans now flew within arrow's range of each other, and the morning air began to fill with the tension that precedes inevitable violence. The first flight of arrows rose from the Minamoto vessels like a dark cloud against the azure sky, their whistling song harmonizing with the crash of waves against wooden hulls. Closer, Yoshitsune's voice carried across the water as his flagship surged forward, leading the charge that would bring the two forces into hand-to-hand combat. The morning sun climbed higher as ship crashed against ship in a thunderous symphony of splintering wood and clashing steel. Tomomori found himself engaged with a young Minamoto warrior whose technique spoke of excellent training, but whose eyes betrayed his inexperience with mortal combat. "You fought with honor," Tomomori murmured as he lowered his weapon, watching the light fade from his enemy's eyes. The battle raged with unprecedented ferocity as warriors on both sides demonstrated why the samurai class had come to dominate Japanese warfare. From his command position, Yoshitsune observed the flow of battle with the calculating eye of a born strategist. "The current is beginning to turn," reported his naval advisor, an experienced captain who had served the Minamoto cause since the war's beginning. Yoshitsune nodded grimly. The treacherous currents of Danora were notorious among sailors, and the Taira had chosen their position well. "Signal the reserve squadrons," he commanded. "Full assault on the Imperial vessel. End this quickly." The order spread through the Minamoto fleet with military efficiency, and soon fresh warriors were joining the fray. On the Taira flagship, young Emperor Antoku sat in terrified silence. As the sounds of battle grew ever closer to his protected cabin, the screams of wounded men mingled with the crash of waves. As the battle entered its most desperate phase, a massive Minamoto warrior, his armor bearing the distinctive mon of a Sasaki clan, had just boarded the Taira flagship with a roar that seemed to shake the very timbers. "Face me, Taira dogs," Moritsune bellowed, his blade already stained with the blood of 3 opponents. Tomomori stepped forward to accept the challenge, his naginata held in the classical ready position. The two men circled each other like predators, each seeking to read the other's intentions in the subtle shifts of stance and grip. Moritsune's sword swept in a horizontal cut, designed to take his opponent's head, while Tomomori's naginata thrust toward the Minamoto warrior's chest. Both weapons found only air as the combatants twisted away from death by inches. They separated, circled again, and came together in a flurry of strikes that rang like temple bells across the water. Around them, the battle seemed to pause as other warriors recognized the significance of this encounter when champions of opposing clans met in single combat. The outcome often influenced the morale of entire armies. The first exchange came with lightning speed. From his command vessel, Yoshitsune watched the duel with professional interest while simultaneously coordinating the broader assault. "It grieves me that we must meet as enemies." But even as steel rang against steel, both warriors were aware that individual combat would not determine the day's outcome. The larger battle was turning decisively against the Taira cause, and no amount of personal heroism could change that fundamental reality. Outside, the sounds of combat were growing closer, punctuated by the distinctive war cries of Minamoto warriors who had never known defeat. But their movement was hampered by the same narrow straits that had initially favored their position. The retreating ships would have to pass through a gauntlet of Minamoto forces, and few would survive the passage. His grandmother Tokiko made a decision that would echo through Japanese history. "The emperor is but a child, spare him the fate you choose for yourself," to legitimize the rule of those who destroyed his grandfather's legacy. She looked down at the boy in her arms, who stared up at her with the solemn eyes of a child who understood that something momentous was occurring. "Noya Minamoto, we go to join the Dragon King in his palace beneath the waves. At least there, our honor remains intact." The young general had hoped to capture the emperor alive. The legitimacy that came with controlling the imperial person would have solidified Minamoto rule and potentially ended the civil war. The Taira champion's naginata had found the gap in his opponent's armor, and the gray Sasaki warrior was sinking to his knees, his life's blood pooling on the salt-stained wood. The sacred imperial regalia, the mirror, sword, and jewel that had legitimized imperial rule for centuries vanished with them into the depths. Even the most hardened veterans found themselves moved by the sight of such determined loyalty. Yoshitsune stood at the rail, staring down into the water where ripples marked the passage of Japan's child emperor into legend. But even in victory, Tomomori showed no triumph, only the weary satisfaction of a duty fulfilled. They will be honored in death as they honored themselves in life. Now, faced with the prospect of that prize slipping literally into the depths, he made a desperate attempt at diplomacy. The Minamoto had won the battle in the war, but at the cost of the very legitimacy they had sought to capture. The death of Emperor Antoku had transformed the battle's meaning. What had begun as a struggle for political supremacy had become something deeper, more personal. Do we continue resistance or follow our emperor? The young Minamoto commander had removed his helmet, revealing a face that seemed older than his 26 years. The burden of victory, Tomomori realized, could be as heavy as the burden of defeat. From his position, Tomomori could see individual acts of heroism and desperation playing out on distant deck samurai, choosing death over capture, captains scuttling their own ships rather than surrender them to enemy hands. I offer you terms of surrender now, and you and your remaining men will be permitted to take Buddhist vows and retire from the world. Your skills would be wasted in needless death. His kusazuri dented from the day's fighting, his do bearing the scratches of a dozen campaigns. His kabuto inherited from his father, who had died at the Battle of Hagen nearly 30 years before, with the sacred regalia lost beneath the waves. The war's outcome seemed almost secondary to the demonstration of absolute loyalty he had just witnessed. Minamoto no Yoshitsune, your reputation for courtesy and victory is well deserved, but you offer life to men who have already chosen death. We followed our emperor into battle. We will follow him into whatever realm awaits beyond. When poets sing of this day, let them remember that we died as samurai should, with honor intact and loyalty unbroken. The Taira name will be spoken with respect as long as warriors gather to hear tales of courage. Honor them in victory as they have honored you in defeat. Their crews faced a stark choice: death by drowning or death by meal. Tomomori's remaining followers formed a defensive circle around their commander, their weapons ready for the last charge they would ever make. But instead of ordering an attack, the Taira leader did something unexpected. He began to recite the death poem he had composed during the long night before battle. Most chose the sea, following their clan's ancient tradition that preferred death to dishonor. Tomomori looked around at the handful of warriors still capable of fighting, perhaps 20 men out of the hundreds who had begun the day aboard this vessel. They watched him with eyes that held no fear, only the calm acceptance of men who had made peace with their fate. Taking the child in her arms, she whispered, "The time has come to join your grandfather beneath the waves." But they stopped in stunned silence at the sight that greeted them. The aged Taira, no Tokiko, stood at the stern rail, holding the child Emperor Ontoku in her arms. The sacred imperial regalia clutched against her chest. "Even in death, we shall not surrender our honor to these eastern barbarians. He awaits with all our ancestors in the realm beneath the waves. We go to join them in honor. Will grandfather be waiting for us in the water palace? The sea will be our tomb before we bow to Minamoto rule." The tide was indeed turning. Both literally and figuratively, the current had shifted to favor the Taira position, but Minamoto numbers were beginning to tell. Both warriors bore wounds from the fierce exchange. Tomomori's shoulder armor hung in tatters where his opponent, S-blade, had found its mark, while Moritsuna's face bore a long cut from the Naginata's razor edge. They paused, breathing heavily, each recognizing the other's skill. Several enemy vessels had been captured or sunk, and the imperial ship was now surrounded by hostile forces. My lord called one of his officers. The Taira are signaling retreat toward the western shore. Yoshitsune raised his spyglass and confirmed the report. Several Taira vessels were indeed attempting to disengage on the embattled flagship. The duel between Tomomori and Moritsuna had reached its climax. "You fight with honor, Sasaki," Tomomori said formally. "Your ancestors smile upon your prowess." "As do yours," Taira Moritsuna replied with equal courtesy. The brief moment of mutual respect passed, and they engaged again with renewed fury. Young Emperor Ontoku's cabin shook as enemy warriors fought their way closer to the imperial quarters. The sacred regalia gleamed in the dim cabin light as grandmother and emperor prepared for their final journey. The cabin door splintered under the impact of a war axe, and Minamoto warriors poured through the breach like water through a burst. "Damn, warriors of the East," she called out in a voice that carried the authority of imperial blood. "You have won this day, but you shall not claim our honor." Yoshitsune himself had boarded the flagship and now stood among his men, his face grave as he comprehended the scene before him. "Honorable lady," he called out, his voice respectful despite the circumstances. "There is no shame in surrender when resistance becomes impossible." Tokiko's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Spare him for what? To live as your puppet?" On the deck behind Yoshitsune, the duel between Tomomori and Moritsuna had reached its conclusion. "Tell my lord Yoshitsune," Moritsuna gasped with his final breath, "that he faces warriors of true quality." The current continued its relentless change, and several Taira vessels that had attempted retreat were now trapped against the rocky shore. As documented in multiple historical sources, including the chronicles maintained by Buddhist monks at nearby monasteries, the scene that followed would become one of the most tragic and memorable in Japanese military history. Emperor Ontoku looked up at his grandmother one final time, his small voice barely audible above the sounds of battle. "Yes, my dear one," Tokiko whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. With those words, she stepped backward off the rail, and grandmother and emperor disappeared beneath the dark waters of Danonu. A profound silence fell over the assembled warriors, broken only by the sound of wind and wave. "Retrieve the boat," as he commanded quietly. But the treacherous currents of Danoa had already claimed their prize, carrying the imperial remains toward the open sea. Tomomori stood alone on the blood-soaked deck of the Imperial flagship, surrounded by the bodies of fallen comrades and enemies alike. The remaining Taira vessels were scattered across the strait, some burning, others listing heavily as their crews either fought desperately or prepared to follow their emperor's example. My lord Tomomori called a surviving retainer, his armor battered and his face streaked with blood. "We have secured the stern quarters." The question hung in the salt air like incense in a temple. "We are samurai," he said simply. "We fight until we can fight no more." Yoshitsune approached under a flag of parley, his retainers forming a respectful escort as he walked among the carnage. "Taira no Tomomori," Yoshitsune called out formally. "You have fought with honor that will be remembered for generations." Tomomori's response came without hesitation. The Taira champion began removing his armor piece by piece, each item representing years of service and countless battles. "However," Tomomori continued as he worked, "I would ask one favor of the victorious Minamoto." Yoshitsune bowed deeply. "It shall be as you wish." The final act began as the sun reached its zenith. Like cherry blossoms scattered by the spring wind, we fall without regret. Our honor blooms eternal. In the memory of men. The words carried across the water, reaching friend and foe alike. Even among the Minamo ranks, hardened warriors found themselves moved by the dignity of their enemies' final moments. They came not as desperate men seeking to sell their lives dearly, but as warriors fulfilling the ultimate expression of their code. The Minamoto troops, recognizing the sacred nature of what they witnessed, formed ranks to receive the attack with appropriate ceremony. This was how samurai were supposed to die, not in desperate scrambling for life, but in calm acceptance of fate's decree. 20 Taira warriors against 200 Minamoto. The outcome was never in doubt. The numbers told the story of a hard-fought victory, nearly 300 Minamoto dead, with twice that number wounded. But it was the Taira losses that truly revealed the battle's devastating nature. Of the 1,000 warriors who had begun the day serving the child emperor, fewer than 50 had survived to see sunset. But in those final moments, as steel met steel for the last time, something transcendent occurred. Local fishermen, pressed into service by Minamoto commanders, reported strange disturbances in the water whirlpools appearing where none should exist, and fish floating belly up as if poisoned by some invisible force. The common folk whispered that the sea itself mourned the death of their divine ruler. "Those who choose exile over surrender have already paid a price higher than any execution we might impose." The boundaries between victor and vanquished seemed to dissolve, leaving only the pure expression of warrior spirit that both sides shared. But Yoshitsune's instinct for mercy had been shaped by what he had witnessed at Dananora, the sight of warriors choosing death over dishonor, of a grandmother sacrificing herself and her emperor grandson rather than accept defeat. The sacred mirror was found by divers years later, though local legend claimed it had lost its divine luster. The image of Emperor Antoku disappearing beneath the waves would inspire artists and writers, becoming one of the most haunting scenes in Japanese literature. Fishermen claimed to see ghostly warriors walking on the water during storm nights, eternally reenacting their final battle. At Danora, 2 great clans had discovered that some victories could only be achieved through defeat, and some defeats were more glorious than any triumph. The tale of the Taira clan's final stand became the subject of countless poems, plays, and stories, not as a celebration of Minamoto victory, but as a meditation on the nature of honor, loyalty, and the price of absolute devotion to principle. Children playing near the shore spoke of hearing war drums and the sound of breaking waves, and a scream of naginata cutting through sea spray. The ceremony was conducted by Buddhist monks from nearby temples. Their chanted sutras carrying across the water as smoke from cremation fires rose toward the darkening sky. It was a gesture of respect that would be remembered long after the political implications of the victory had faded. By the laws of war, they should be hunted down and destroyed to prevent future rebellions. In death, the enemies of Danora had become joined by their shared understanding of what it meant to live and die as samurai. But something about the day's events had changed his perspective on such matters. The jewel was reportedly retrieved by fishermen and returned to the imperial court, but the sacred sword Mnomurakumo remained lost beneath the waves, adding to the mystique surrounding the battle's aftermath. One by one, Tomomori's followers stepped forward to make their own death poems before joining their commander in his final charge. The clash, when it came, was brief but fierce. The waters of Dananora turned crimson as the spring tide carried the debris of battle toward the open sea. Broken arrows floated alongside scraps of silk and fragments of lacquered armor, while the cries of seabirds replaced the war shouts that had echoed across the strait throughout the long morning. The victory is complete. The Minamoto clan now held undisputed control over Japan, and his brother Yoritomo would soon establish the first military government in the nation's history. Yet the young commander felt no elation, only a profound weariness that seemed to settle into his bones like winter cold. By noon, the last Taira vessel had either surrendered or sunk, and the 5-year Genpei War had reached its conclusion. Yoshitsune stood on the deck of his flagship, watching his men search the water for survivors and salvageable equipment. The casualty reports, my lord, offered his aid, presenting a scroll covered in precise brushstrokes. The search for Emperor Antoku's body continued through the afternoon. but the treacherous currents had carried their prize far from the battlefield. According to contemporary accounts preserved in the Azumaki, the official chronicle of the Kamakura government, several of the sacred imperial regalia were eventually recovered. As evening approached, Yoshitsune ordered funeral rites for both Minamoto and Tira dead. "My lord," said one of his senior retainers as they watched the smoke dissipate. "What orders for pursuit of the remaining Tira forces?" Yoshitsune considered the question carefully. Several minor Tira commanders had escaped with small contingents, fleeing toward the remote islands of western Japan. "Let them go," he said finally. "Those who wish to take Buddhist vows and withdraw from the world may do so without interference." The decision would prove controversial among some Minamoto allies, who felt that complete eradication of Taira bloodlines was necessary for lasting peace. As night fell over the strait, local residents began to report strange phenomena that would persist for generations. The Battle of Dan-no-ura had ended, but its echoes would resonate through Japanese culture for centuries to come. Tamamori's death poem, preserved by Yoshitsune's scribes, would be carved into stone monuments and taught to generations of young samurai as an example of how warriors should face defeat. Years later, when Yoshitsune himself faced betrayal and death at the hands of his own brother, witnesses reported that his final words were a quotation from Tamamori's poem. The spring tide that had carried away the imperial regalia eventually returned them to Japanese shores. But the honor demonstrated in their loss had already become more precious than any earthly treasure.